My name is Tero Mustonen and I have two jobs. I work as a professional fisherman mostly in the winter time, and I also have a science training, or I'm a geographer. And I work for an NGO or non-profit organization called Snowchange Cooperative. And in my research I just ended a 5-year mission under the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where I was a lead author for the Arctic and Europe. Most of my research has to do with a nexus between the Arctic. I have worked in Alaska, Canada, Siberia, European North, Australia and New Zealand. And the work that I research and focus on is essentially biodiversity, climate change, and then socio-ecology. How local human populations, indigenous peoples and shall we say non-humans work together and are affected by climate and biodiversity drivers. Citizens' role in biodiversity and addressing the crisis in which we are, it's often known as the sixth extinction event or wave, is critical. Because we have to always ask why. Why are we in this crisis? Why is the biodiversity changing? And a lot of the problems are associated with the way we organize our societies, our economy, our transport, and our codependency as a part of the global system. Now, we often get the question, what is the citizen to do, and how do we form alliances all the way from the local people to the highest levels of international order? If we try to put this question first in the international cooperation, we have now started to get recognition under the United Nations. For example, on a range of ways, citizens around the world are looking at and observing biodiversity. So one of the things to keep in mind here is that before we can act, we have to know what's going on. Status, trends, observations, population situation regarding biodiversity. Therefore, on the international level, we have a number of organizations, for example, Convention on Biological Diversity, in some ways the UNFCCC, the Climate Convention, and then other United Nations mechanisms that have recognized other ways of knowing in addition to science in biodiversity. And mostly I would try to name these ways of knowing in the following. We have the nowadays quite established role of indigenous knowledge. In fact, science shows that out of the world's remaining biodiversity, about 80% is in the indigenous homelands around the world and home areas. So without venturing too much into any kind of speculation, we can look at science and determine the fact that indigenous peoples and their knowledge that they are possessing around the world is critically linked with biodiversity. It's essential. In fact, you could go as far as to argue that many remaining and surviving indigenous societies can be called socio-ecological systems. What it really means is that there's a dependency between people and nature, biodiversity. And therefore it's highly valuable to engage and try to work with those citizens who are indigenous peoples. They may contain ethics, morals, wisdoms, and backcasting what has been changing and in what ways. The other way of looking at this from the indigenous knowledge and citizens' knowledge is to try to think about cultural indicators. In the cultural and linguistic diversity, for example, in the research I have done with my colleagues, we have tried to look at how it's not only biological diversity, but it's actually interconnected. The languages, dialects, and cultural practices are very closely and intimately linked with natural systems and the biodiversity they hold. Well, what about the other people, non-indigenous societies? We also have under the UN, for example, Convention on Biological Diversity and IUCN, International Organization Maintaining Conservation, a clear recognition of local people. And often we can understand and engage in the citizen science and citizens' knowledge through something called traditional ecological knowledge or local knowledge. Those are some of the ways that international system looks at the question of citizens and biodiversity. Here at home and in Europe, of course, the only indigenous peoples are the Sami. I have been working with the Sami for over 25 years, even though my roots are here in Karelia. And we can clearly see the value and memory of landscapes, species and change that's we can say embedded in the life with the indigenous Sami people. Or if we have a new shift, for example under climate change, red fox is moving into the area of the Sami people, and Arctic fox in Finland is becoming almost extinct, or at the, shall we say, interface between being a victim of these drivers. It is then critically important that we work with the Sami to understand how populations, biodiversity and the whole Arctic and the North is shifting. But there's one catch here. There's one thing that we never discuss in biodiversity, because a lot of biodiversity research is looking at citizen science or citizens' knowledge as data. However, we are now in a position, also in Finland, we are waking up to this question that in fact indigenous knowledge has value on its own. And when we are working with Sami or some traditional fishermen or any citizen, we should be following the principle of free, prior and informed consent. And there are also rights and, for the lack of a better term, authorship or being authors of that knowledge nowadays. So it's not only data. So in conclusion, by working with local people, indigenous peoples or citizens, if you just want to call that, and biodiversity, one of the most important things that I can convey from my own research are essentially 2 points. One is that researchers also need to be humble. We need to rethink how we are engaging with that critically important link between humans and biodiversity. And secondly, especially with those communities like the indigenous peoples or traditional communities, we need to listen. And not to impose science or any other metrics on how we understand it. And perhaps from this collaboration and partnership, we can then come to a place where we understand biodiversity much better. And that's what the citizens can do. They can engage, they can share, they can inform. Science cannot operate everywhere. It also operates in ways like remote sensing and others where scale is often so big that we don't know. We don't know exactly where the Arctic fox used to nest, for example, in the Sami area in 1950s or early 1900s. And that's why it's very fruitful and important to engage with citizens in biodiversity. But it has to happen in a way that respects and listens to those other ways of knowing, and especially indigenous knowledge. Well, a lot of the world's conservation for biodiversity still historically has happened through the states and nation states and governmental agencies. Today we know that there is one analytical concept that's really central to that form of conservation, and it has to do with power. A lot of the initiatives to try to conserve biodiversity and globally started from classical examples of, for example, Yellowstone in the US, where United States politicians and people thought that industrialization is proceeding so fast in the 1800s that something of the original nature has to be kept intact. Perhaps like a show or theater or a place where people could then come and see how it used to be when a lot of the landscapes are transformed and biodiversity which is associated with those landscapes turns into something else. What the story doesn't tell, or let me put it this way, Yellowstone National Park became the foundation of the modern state-led national parks and conservation territories. What we don't talk about too easily is the fact that this act of creating Yellowstone or Masai Mara or Serengeti or some of the other big parks around the world happened by kicking out the indigenous peoples that were living there and had been governing maintaining and coexisting with the biodiversity species and their homelands that had been inside Yellowstone, for example, for a long time. For example, the Blackfeet. Native Americans called the Blackfeet used to live around Yellowstone. And here we come to a notion of realization now in 2020s that we can call fortress conservation. What I mean by that is that conservation has been taking place top down, and it has been associated with society and power. And now, for the past maybe 30-35 years, we have come to a place where indigenous peoples, civil society organizations are challenging that power. They are now challenging the way that conservation and biodiversity work happens. It doesn't mean that we cannot work with the states or governments, but it's very important that civil society organizations and public, shall we say, the public has now a critical view and also is able to produce alternatives when we are in this crisis. Why? Why would I say so? The justification for this view comes from what has happened in the past that led us to this crisis. And that was the governmental anti-economic system that we have had in the West and now in the global system for over 200 years, maybe even more. So a lot of the civil society organizations that are engaged in biodiversity work, for example, Land is Life, Conservation International, Sierra Club, or many other organizations are now able to show that we can't fix the biodiversity crisis. We can't solve it in the same model only as the way Yellowstone was created, perhaps like a postcard or isolated area, and then everything is free to be grabbed by economy, industry, and the large populations. So the most important lesson that the civil society organizations and, shall we say, the public organizations often can try to produce, non-state organizations in biodiversity, is to do things in a new way. And maybe I could give an example from my own work here in Finland. As I said, I work for an organization called Snowchange Cooperative. It's a non-state, fully independent NGO that operates all across the country, from the high Arctic or Inari, Utsjoki, all the way to Western Finland. And because in Finland the nature conservation and work on biodiversity has been mostly state-led, and yet the Sami, the Finns, the Karelians and many other ethnic groups and indigenous peoples here have felt excluded or marginalized by conservation, we felt about 10 years ago that it's a very positive and friendly and good reform that we could try to bring into biodiversity work in Finland. And that's why we founded Landscape Rewilding Program under Snowchange. This Landscape Rewilding Program is not only about conservation of biodiversity, it's also rewilding and restoration of habitats. Because in Finland we have lost over 90% of our natural forests below the Arctic Circle and most of our natural peatlands for industrial land use. Fine, it has given us financial and society well-being, but at what price? And now many young people are asking, what will Finland do in this critical nexus of where we are with these simultaneous crises? A major war in Europe, biodiversity losses, and of course the ever-present climate change getting worse. That's why we founded a non-state biodiversity benefiting program called Landscape Rewilding. If we look at the metrics, we can see that it works. In 5 years, we have been able to influence 50,000 hectares over 66 sites across the country in a positive form. If we look at scientific results, in many of our rewilding sites, we have seen the comeback from 2 bird species on peatland into 200 species of birds. For example, in Linnunsuo, here in North Karelia, following our rewilding and restoration work. So we have to do in this present moment everything. But it's not an easy question to answer how we are to do that regarding biodiversity and its protection, rewilding and restoration so that the species will have more space. And finally, on the landscape level, how do we maintain interconnectivity, for example? How do we create systems that support those species like Atlantic salmon that are dependent on the ocean, but they come back to the rivers to spawn? These are extremely hard and complex issues. And as I said before, in conclusion, we have found out that the old solutions are not the only ones that will help us or even save us. That's why civil society organizations, indigenous peoples, and all other non-state actors are needed. They are extremely important. They are not against anybody. In fact, we have to form this historic alliance, at least here in Finland, to finally show again to nature that we are not the enemy.